Good day, everybody. I'm George Beaton, Program Chair at the College of Law for the new Master in Legal Business suite of offerings that we have. Today we're talking with Katherine Thomas, one of the inaugural teaching fellows for the College of Law's Master in Legal Business suite of programs. And Katherine's a specialist in the field of strategy and will be teaching that subject. Katherine, tell us about your experience in strategy and what you're looking forward to from a teaching perspective in a highlight sense.
Yeah, thanks, George. I've spent around 20 years advising law firms on a variety of issues, including marketing, sales and business development. And in addition to that, I've spent time within a large law firm establishing a new service line, and that occurred in 2012 and is known as Vario. So that's really where my interest in and involvement in strategy for law firms started. And then since then, I've spent my time consulting to law firms on how they can develop a strong and sustainable and robust strategy.
Katherine, so let's jump into an area that many of the participants in this group will be asking. Why is strategy back on the agenda? Why is strategy apparently more important than ever for both law firms and law departments to differentiate themselves and give their customers a reason to prefer them over the many choices that customers have now?
Yeah. Well, George, it's really because there's so much going on out there in our industry at the moment. Competition really is increasing. And I love this phrase, the requirement for legal advice doesn't necessitate now the requirement for a law firm, and it doesn't necessitate the requirement for an in-house team. Actually, there are lots of different options in terms of how one might manage one's legal risk. So now we're looking at a variety of different legal services providers. Instead of that kind of binary distinction between law firm and in-house. And at the same time as that kind of increase in competition, what we've seen is barriers to entry really reducing. So clearly regulatory constraints have reduced over recent years, but also the resources that it requires to establish oneself as a legal services provider. They've significantly reduced over the last number of years. Also, what I'm seeing is that buyers are more informed about their options and more motivated to switch than they ever have been before. And I also like to look at the supply side of things, which is largely still the human resources in a law firm. So lawyers. And lawyers now have more options than they ever had before. And so, the power of those suppliers is greater than it ever was. And so what you get from all of that is a real cocktail of increasingly intense competition. And in that environment, what you need to do is really help your clients to buy. So help them to understand what you stand for and the benefits that you deliver. And strategy is just foundational for that. It's so important to that because it identifies the value that your business offers. And then what it also does is directs action and resources to creating that value and also to communicating it. So I couldn't agree more, George. In this changing market for legal services, having a clear and distinctive strategy that importantly you actually execute on is just more important than ever.
So if we take this down, say, to smaller law firms as a particular part of the supply side of the market, let's say there are 4,000 or 5,000 in Australia, and in any one geographical area there might be 100. And we are now talking to 100 firms, say in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where I come from, saying to them, you need a strategy that will differentiate you. And they say, well, how do we be different from, in a way that's meaningful to our clients and prospective clients, from 99 other firms? Is that possible, Katherine?
Look, I think it is, but it requires some real soul searching and understanding of the market. So it's got to start with those clients, and what those clients need and want. So any strategy that is just created in a vacuum is not going to succeed. And so regardless of the size of your organization, whether you're a big city centre law firm or one of the smaller organizations that you describe in suburban Melbourne, the first thing you need to do is to understand just what your clients' needs and wants are, but really also what their desires are, what their pain points are, and how you can address them. And then you need to develop and wrap a strategy around that explicitly addresses the issues that your clients have on their table. But also, really importantly, I think what a firm like that can do to stand out is actually to consistently and clearly execute on their strategy. So the graveyards of strategy are littered with well-meaning plans that were written with a high degree of enthusiasm, but really have no execution related to them. So the firms that win out, yes, they do have a clear and distinctive strategy rooted in their clients' needs, but actually also they really consistently execute on that strategy and do it over and over again, repeating their messages and being really clear about what they offer that is distinctive out there in the market.
What you're talking about here is how the lawyers and managers of the firms conduct themselves, how they behave basically, and collectively what that represents in terms of how we do things around here, or the culture of the firm. And Peter Drucker, the late great Peter Drucker, is famous for many things, including one saying that goes along the lines of culture eats strategy for breakfast. What's your take on how well law firms and law departments, for that matter, are doing in actively managing their cultures?
Yeah, I love that phrase because it reminds us that strategy is not enough. Like, a great strategy is not enough to succeed and win on its own. You actually need to live that strategy and deliver it. And I will, if I may, just quickly touch upon what Drucker was meaning when he talked about culture. I think my sense is he was talking about organizational culture, which is essentially that kind of shared, a group of shared assumptions that guide and determine the behaviours of individuals within a business. And that's so important because it is one of the single greatest influences over the choices that people within a business make. And that is why it's so important to implementing strategy. Because the implementation of any strategy is about what the people within an organisation do. And at a really basic level, it's about what they choose to do and what they choose to prioritise and how they spend their time. So look, my take is that there's so much more that we could do here. I think there has been a far greater focus on culture in law firms and in-house legal teams, particularly over the last 5 years. And we've developed some really sophisticated and interesting language describe it. But my take is that actually the lived reality of culture isn't matching up to the rhetoric. Yeah. And George, I think that's really for two reasons. The first is that actively managing culture really requires everybody to take a role in it. And that rarely happens in a lot of organisations. And when I think about that, I'm reminded of I don't know whether you've seen that kind of. There's a strip cartoon, and it's just two images. And there's the first image is a crowd of people with their hands up around a speaker who's saying, "Who wants change?" And they're all putting their hands up. Well, I want change. And then the second image is the same crowd, but with their hands down as the speaker asks, and who of you is going to change? So change is absolutely fine. It's a really great idea, but it's something that everybody else should do. And it's the same thing really in a lot of organizations in relation to culture. Having a clear and consistent and coherent culture, it's really, really, really important. And I think everybody should do it, but it's just not quite necessarily. think that's the first issue, is that we still have quite a lot of work to do to really enable individuals to understand their role in relation to the kind of creation and sustainability of a positive culture. But the second reason, George, is that, I do think that the active management of culture does require making difficult decisions. And I see this in, a lot of organisations that I've worked with over the years. You get those moments of truth where, and quite often it's senior management, but not always, have to make a decision as to whether they will let things pass or actually whether they will address behaviour and attitudes that don't fit with their culture. And so, it's there's quite a web of reasons as to why perhaps we're not doing as much as we should in terms of developing the kind of culture that helps us implement a distinctive strategy. I think we're at the start of that journey. The signs are positive, but there is a lot more work that can be done.
And the law firm partnership structure and culture and systems, including the remuneration systems, make this doubly hard compared to a corporate which has a different style of culture because it's structured, there's separation of shareholders from management and a whole range of differences which people posit is easier in a corporate culture than in a partnership culture. And partnerships have to double down and recognise that there are many benefits to being a partnership, but there are also some drawbacks, and one of them is change, particularly cultural change. And that's a thesis that you're strong on, Katherine.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I actually don't believe that partnerships, can't change, and inherently are averse to change. But I do agree with your suggestion, George, that there are certain structural elements of a partnership, not least the managers and leaders of the business are also the owners and the shareholders. There are certain elements of the partnership that make it more difficult, more challenging. There are also certain elements of partnership that make this easier. I really like, you've probably come across that Johnson and Scholes cultural web model that just looks at 7 aspects of an organisation that contribute to culture. And what I really like about that is, it talks about power structures and kind of organisational structures, which, we're all pretty familiar with. But it also talks about some of the other aspects that contribute to culture. So kind of rituals and routines, symbols and shared stories. And actually, I do think that partnerships can be really strong in that regard. The nature of a partnership is such that it's potentially a lot easier to develop those shared stories and symbols and rituals than it might be in a more conventional corporate structure. That said, it's also, given that it's perhaps more straightforward to do that in a partnership, it's easier also to develop negative stories, symbols and rituals that actually are antithetical to the kind of culture that you're trying to develop.
Katherine, so let's round this out this morning with some tips from you about executing. You've made the point very well that formulating is kind of easy, and as somebody once said, inspiration for formulation is like 10%, and the execution is perspiration, and it's the 90%. So what are your tips, a few of your tips for executing successfully?
Yeah, thanks, George. I mean, for me, there are 3 key things. The first is make sure that your strategy is actually rooted in reality. So I see a lot of organisations that develop strategies based on a wish list. And having kind of stretching targets is absolutely fine, but they still need to be based in the reality of what your organisation is, what your market is, and the strengths and attributes that the people within your organisation have. So that's the first thing, root it in reality. Secondly, I'd say, recognise that strategic planning is a journey, not an event. So it never ends. It's not something that is nice and neat. You can put away in a drawer and come back and refer to it a year later. Strategy needs to be continually measured, assessed, and refined. So it's a never-ending activity. And for me, the third point, going back to what you said as you asked me that question, is that execution is the key. Strategy planning is one thing. It's interesting, it's enjoyable, it's exciting, but in a lot of respects, it's the easy bit. It's relatively neat, it's controllable. But in contrast, execution, it's imperfect. It's often kind of quite messy and untidy, and can feel quite uncomfortable. But the adage that execution is really where the value comes from is absolutely true. We need to focus on actually making the strategy happen. No good having a strategy, gathering dust in a drawer. What you need to do is live that strategy, execute on it, and accept that execution is imperfect, but do it anyway.
That's a wonderful way to end, Katherine. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insight and your wisdom with us today. As we introduced, Katherine is the teaching fellow for the strategy subject, and her focus is on the success that good strategizing, both formulation and execution, brings to an organisation. We're really looking forward to the launch of your subject, Katherine, on the Master of Legal Business suite of programs. Thank you very much.